On behalf of my colleagues at the Danube Institute and our partners on this occasion at Helena History Press, may I welcome you to the launch of an important new book, Nation and Europe, by János Martonyi, published by Helena History Press, which will be followed, Dr. Martonyi's speech will be followed by a discussion between him and three formidable critics, whom I will introduce in a moment. Before I do so, I would like to welcome the large audience this event has attracted even before it goes out to the wider world via the internet. You include tonight some very prominent people from politics, academic life, diplomacy, and the media, whom you would normally expect to find on the platform rather than in the audience. And I would like to welcome them. I can't, I'm afraid, mention all their names, too many. And secondly, because I see a number in the audience whom but not all. Among them, however, is the president of our partners at Helena History Press, Dr. Catherine Kydal-Lynn, who's the publisher of Nation and Europe. I should add that Helena History Press has done sterling work bringing the accurate history of Hungary in modern times to the English-speaking world in a series of important books by its statesmen, its historians, and its thinkers, past and present. Dr. Lynn, we at Danube are proud to be associated with your work. I'd also like to welcome the presence of Marian Smith-Lacey, president of the Common Sense Society, originally founded in Hungary, but now a force internationally, and Anna Smith-Lacey, who is the executive director of the Hungary Foundation in the United States, which brings able young graduates with a special interest in Central Europe to spend a year in this country learning about the region in greater depth. I think a certain theme has emerged in these opening remarks, the need for, but also the appetite for, more and more accurate information about Hungary, Central Europe, and the relations of both with the rest of Europe and the wider world. That need and that appetite will be more than met by this book, the book we are launching today, and I forecast too, by the discussion that will follow. Nation and Europe is a collection of brilliant essays on Hungary's post-war and post-change diplomacy, including its trade diplomacy, complete with pen pictures of some of the most important figures shaping it, notably Prime Minister Joseph Antal, and is written, of course, by one of its most able practitioners. It's a work of scholarship by a diplomat and a serious book by a practiced wit. There are a lot of very amusing moments the reader will get from reading it. Minister Martonyi, however, tells us that in a subtitle that this book is in lieu of memoirs. Having read the essays, I can tell him that this feint, clever though it is, will not succeed. Rather, he is whetting the appetite of his readers for more, and I think they will demand it. Well, in addition to the minister, we have assembled a suitable group of experts to discuss it. If I were German, I would list in full all their titles and achievements, both of the interlocutor, of the author and his interlocutors. But that would mean we'd have no time for the discussion. As it is, I will not do so. I will simply keep my introductions short. Our principal speaker, as we know, is Dr. János Martonyi, among other things, Professor Emeritus of the University of Szeged, former foreign minister on 2 long occasions. Professor Dr. István Stumpf, Professor of Constitutional Law and Political Science, former minister, former justice of the Constitutional Court. And I should mention here that we're very lucky in having the present President of the Court, the Supreme Court, President Suljok, and thank you for attending. I should also mention two other distinguished members of the audience, simply because, in addition to everything else, they were close colleagues in the Hungarian Review and in the Danube Institute. Obviously, Gyula Kotolányi, who is has been my editor at the magazine for the last 10 years, and the Dr. Visi, Sylvester Visi, the distinguished scientist, who was for a while the president of the think tank, the Martonyi Foundation, which is our parent organization. So it's a great pleasure to see them here today. Now, I turn to the distinguished commentators. I've mentioned Dr. Stumpf. I also welcome Peter Gottfried, member of the Monetary Council of the Hungarian National Bank, a former State Secretary for European Integration, and György Szapáry, Chief Advisor to the Governor of the Central Hungarian National Bank and a former Ambassador of Hungary to the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, I think I have delighted you enough. I now step aside and invite Professor Martonyi to introduce his book.
Thank you, John. You have a fantastic authority, because when you started to speak, there was that silence. So thank you. In any case, I don't want to, let's say, address anybody, because that has been done by yourself, John. Maybe the only person I would like to extend a very special welcome is Endre Juhász, a former justice in the European Court of Justice, and of course I'm very happy that he's also here, given the fact that we went together to gymnasium and also to the law school, apart from other things, but just I wanted to mention this. So I would have thought that I would be in a panel, but now I realize that I have to make a speech on my own. Well, I try to do it as briefly as possible. First word definitely is a word of thanks. Katalin Kádár has already been mentioned. She's, of course, the key person because she's the editor. And now our main task is, once it has been published, is to sell it. So I think this is also part of the game. But I really would like to thank you all who organized this event as well, and also took part in the preparation of the publishing of this book, which I have to apologize as well for, because the subtitle is in lieu of Memoirs. Now that gives the impression this is perhaps just a marketing tool, that these are real memoirs and some diplomatic secrets will be revealed. I'm sorry, you only find boring studies and essays in the book, so this is not about the secret life of a foreign minister. Speaking about boring, well, I remember when the Hungarian book was launched, and we had a somewhat similar event at the University of Public Service. I said that you don't need to read everything, so if you want to save time, please just read the introduction, which gives a survey, it gives a summary of the whole book, and it's in in fact, it's also a short independent essay, but to save time, that's enough to read. Now, if this is too much of reading for the reader, which I can also imagine in the present times, you should perhaps just read the foreword or recommendation, as it is called, written by my good friend István Stumpf. It's even shorter, it's just a couple of pages, 8, 9, 10 pages. Now, in the meantime, I realized that there is even a shorter version of that, and this is in the book. So, in the book's cover, in the inside, that is the shortest possible version. The author of this also István Stumpf, but it has been translated in English. So what I try to explain briefly in the introduction, which I refer to, is that this is a continuation. And there is an element of permanence or continuity in what I try to put on paper in the last couple of decades. The subject is very much the same, and also perhaps the basic message is also the same, I would say, or identical. It started in 98 with the title Europe, Nation and Rule of Law. And those are studies that were written in the first half of the 90s. So quite a long time. Then, of course, I never really managed to write when I was in office. So what I did, and when I left the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 2014, second time, then I published, put together and published, again with a kind of introduction, the essays and studies that I prepared prior to become Minister for Foreign Affairs. That is between, if my recollection is correct, 2002 and 2009, 2010, roughly. But that was published much later because I couldn't do it during my being in office. So that was published in 2015. Now then, that was the so-called Blue Book, which I don't see. Anyway, then after a couple of years, in the year 18, I published the so-called Green Book, and that were the studies and essays put together in the last 3 years. The title was We and the World. Now, then again, the last one, and this is in fact the English translation of this book, which is Nation and Europe. It was published in 2021. And in fact, the introduction, which I already mentioned, was written, I put it in the book to avoid any misunderstandings, in August 21. Now, that's the last thing. But there is, again, as I said, a kind of continuation. And I also try to emphasize that while, of course, times are changing, no doubt, and we are also changing with the times, it's quite clear, there is also an element of continuity and permanence. And that's another question, as István Stumpf also puts it in his foreword, that human nature, of course, is more inclined, more tempted to perceive the changes and maybe pays less attention to the permanent elements. But these are still there. These are the basic principles, the basic values, the basic norms, and the basic, I would say, I still insist upon that word, it is the basic identity, individual and collective as well. And that's why one of the cornerstones of my approach or my thinking, I would say, is where do I belong to? And that is the national, let's say, identity. For me, the first thing was to be Hungarian. That is to belong to the Hungarian nation. As I said, I think, was it yesterday? Yeah? That we are a proud nation, no doubt. We are proud because of our literature, because our language, because our legacy, because our identity. And for me, no doubt, this is still the most important thing. By the way, in the endorsements, if my recollection is correct, Benita Ferrero-Waldner, the former Minister for Foreign Affairs of Austria and also Commissioner for the External Affairs of the European Union, she says, and I was very happy to read it, that her impression was that I am, or I was, a passionate Hungarian with a European commitment. Now that's the shortest formula, I think, which I don't need to repeat. Of course, I have a strong commitment to Europe. Somebody asked me the other day, I don't remember exactly where and why, that since when I carry this kind of European commitment. And he wanted to hear that, maybe 20 years, 25 years, and I said from the age of, let's say, 4 or 5 years, which is true. Because I got it from my parents, very simple. I'm a lucky guy in that regard, of course, but I don't want to get into the details. That would take this short introduction too long. European commitment is no doubt another cornerstone. And here perhaps what I would like to mention briefly is a special interest what I have taken all through the decades is Central Europe. I even asked the question somewhere if there is perhaps such a thing as a Central European identity. Of course, this is perhaps too much to say, but there is something common in Central Europe. Well, I tried to list a couple of words somewhere. Maybe it's also referred to in this book. My basic definition is that Central Europe is in fact Europe, but with a higher revolution speed, even more diverse, even more languages, maybe a difficult history, kind of nostalgia, melancholy, even pessimism sometimes, but also a little bit of nervosity, a nervosity which creates or generates creativity. That's all Central Europe. Central Europe, we have, of course, it's well known, kind of inferiority complex, which we tend to convert into a superiority complex, again, well known. I would stop here speaking about Central Europe because somebody might think that I try to put what I feel about Hungarians into a Central European gown. So let's just remain at Central Europe. By the way, a good friend of mine wrote a book, a friend of mine published a book many years ago, a couple of decades ago, and he summarized his story, the years he spent in Budapest as an expat. And he not by chance, not by coincidence, he gave the title to his book, Prague. And I asked why. I didn't want to say Budapest. So, because there were so many people whom are well known, and all the stories and so on. So it was better to say Prague. Now, that is what I would sense as Central Europe. Now, Central Europe, of course, it's not just a feeling and not just those words I try to refer to. By the way, I left out maybe one of the most important feature, and here I would use, not by coincidence, the German word, which is Angst, anxiety. Maybe we have a little bit more anxiety than needed, but don't get into psychology. Let's stay to the subject. Central Europe's importance is increasing. We all know that. Even within the European Union, there is an economic and a geopolitical shift towards the East, quote unquote. It started a long time ago. It started by the German reunification, for instance, shifting the capital from Bonn to Berlin. But then again, of course, the reunification of Europe, which happened with the enlargement, of course, shifted the weight, economic weight and political clout as well towards the East. Of course, the British withdrawal, Brexit also increased this tendency, and the catching up is going on. And hopefully it will go on, just like enlargement will also go on. We all know that it is one of the key objectives of Hungarian European policy for a time being. Now, my task, in fact, would have been to speak about the book. Well, the book is easy because you will all have to, you will all buy it and read it. So. I shouldn't get into all the details. The tributes, as I also said in the book, it's all by coincidence. So there is no plan in it. There is no design whatsoever. Just as in the case in the formerly published Blue Book. It's coincidence because it depended who was inviting me to come or to go somewhere and to speak or to make a presentation on a particular subject, or in most cases on a particular person. So this is just at random in a way, but still I feel that coincidence, it's a very strange phenomenon. One of the last, let's say, important event organized at the French embassy about chance or coincidence. Now, coincidence is also in the system. It was put in the great system by the creator, who created the great system. So it's part of that. So that's why I believe that this was, although it looks like coincidence, it was perhaps something deeper. Now, that's about the tributes. My last word, of course, everything is against the backdrop of the overall global geopolitical and economic, basically international trade developments. After all, international trade is my original, let's say, métier. And that's why maybe I attach a lot of importance to this. And of course, I see some interesting interrelationship and mutual impact between the geopolitical or general political developments and international trade and trade regulation. Nothing new about that. But in the last couple of years, I would say, one phenomenon which I always try to point out is that trade policy and international trade regulation is losing its relative, always very relative independence. Security trumps, as it is said, because security is becoming more and more important. And international trade is more and more, it's a very awkward word, securitized, which means that security considerations are more and more important. Economic considerations are also there, of course, no doubt. Trade is still relevant. I don't want to dismiss it, especially because that used to be my subject at the law school. But still, I have to recognize that this is losing its weight and importance because we all know that because of the developments, security is more important. It's not just about the war, not just about armed conflict, which I don't want to speak about now. I won't even speak about at a later stage. But security in a more general sense, cybersecurity, of course, biological security, health security, pandemics, and so on. So security is becoming more and more important on a local level, on a national level, on a European level, on a global level as well. So that is why I try to summarize a background, a kind of backdrop for that in the general part of the book, which is basically about the geopolitical and trade policy, let's say, developments and some general conclusions I try to draw. Last word, I just would like to repeat what I said. Thank you. First and foremost, thank you all for coming here. I didn't expect such a big interest. I'm very much flattered by that. But all that, of course, is thanks to the Danube Institute, John, and of course, with the expression of my gratitude again, I would like to thank you this time again to you for your attention. Thank you.
May I now invite the three commentators to take their place on the platform. Each of you can decide whether to speak from a seated position or from here. And Dr. Stumpf, you are now on.
Good evening. I think that kind of huge audience is very much representing that János Martonyi, he is a key figure of the Hungarian foreign policy, not just the foreign policy, but he is a very strong intellectual speaker. And when I got the ask that it would be a good idea to write a preface, I read all the 4 books, and it was the very important intellectual challenge for me to look at the last 40 years. And we spent 4 years together in the first Orban government. And he, that time, also represented the wise man in the government. And he has a great experience how to manage the young generation, because that time the prime minister was just 35 years old and I am just 41. And yes, that was the big challenge of the Fidesz that time, how to balance the new radical liberal origin politicians with much more older and experienced politicians, and János was one of that. And the other things is, I just asked me when I read these books that why János changed the focus, because he started Europe and the others, and that was the first book, and the last book was the Nation and Europe. Is this the consequence of his way of thinking, or it is based on his experience, and this is reflecting hiddenly those kind of discussion which is going on, the sovereignist and the federalist question in the Hungarian foreign policy. But he didn't answer that, but I can imagine if you are going to read this book, you can get some kind of answer for that. So I think János, that book, I very much recommend it to read that, because it's more, it is not, yes, it is not a memoir. He promised that he is not going to write a memoir. It is not a monography in the academic way, but this is the book with fresh ideas, so much intellectual background, and very much value-oriented book. It's an important value-oriented, representing the identity of the former foreign minister, who is very much committed to the Euro-Atlantic issues, the Europe, but he is the real people who has a clear idea about the nation. He is a sovereignist and patriotic and Christian democratic people. And all those kind of issues and values very much represented and dominated the book. And I think when we are going to discuss all the issue, the national identity, the constitutional identity, I learned a lot about that when I was involved in the European Judicial Society, which was very close to the Federalist Society. This is the conservative group of people in the United States, a huge group of people. And we regularly discuss those kind of problems which around the world very much touch the issue of the identity and the constitutional identity. And as a constitutional justice, I realized that those issues which arise around the constitutional identity and the conflict between the European Court and the national constitutional court, these issues are going to dominate the next century. That's my product. Thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps I could ask.
Thank you. When I was offered the privilege to say some words at this occasion, I wondered what to put the focus on. To say that the writings of János represent an exceptional quality in a sense that it is quite rare that somebody is able to give a wider perspective and put the issues into a historical and global sense and context, and at the same time to master the details and to be extremely punctual in identifying issues. But I thought that János is a well-known scholar, known in Hungary and in Europe and worldwide. So I need not speak about that. But what left the biggest impact on me when reading this book was the simultaneous presence of timeliness and the resistance of the changes of time. Timeliness for me means, when reading this book, is underlined by the fact that the focus is in these writings on the long-term attachments and determinations when being a true Hungarian patriot, the focus is on being aware of the geopolitical location, on the values we share, on the cultural heritage we share. And these are issues which are resistant to Aktualpolitik. And at times when everyday politics is burdened by emotional issues and conflicts, I think it is very timely to remind us that elements of permanence and stability gives our place in the world and in Europe. And it's a kind of a compass for practicing politicians also, that there is no other option than to identify properly national interests and to represent them in a European and international context, as János did, and as minister. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to speak here. I met János the first time in April 1990 at a meeting with József Antal, Prime Minister designate, not yet Prime Minister, where we were discussing economic policy issues. I arrived to Budapest just a few weeks before as the resident representative of the IMF. And we were talking at that time basically economics, because the economic situation is very, very, very difficult. And then I got a glimpse of the very deep knowledge of János, of the legal and constitutional construction of Europe from the point of view of the interest in Hungary. For instance, we discussed whether we can get any additional money or any money from the European Union while we are not yet members of the European Union. We discussed, etc. And then János said, you know, this is not possible. Exception it might be, but let's not count on it. So, you know, and you were right. And that's so we got money later on bilaterally, but as a non-member, we wanted to get it in 1990 right away, and that we couldn't get. And then you emphasized the trade, and then you looked at trade as you write it in the book, the world trade in the grips of geopolitics. That is very true. And then János was my boss when he was Minister of Foreign Affairs, and I was ambassador to the United States. And he sort of guided me through the arcane relationship that we had at the time with the United States administration, because every law that was passed in 2010 and 2011, the administration at that time found something to criticize. And the guidance of János was very good, because János emphasized very strongly to me, but also to the American counterparts, that Europe is part of the Euro-Atlantic relationship. So János is a convinced Euro-Atlantics, if I am not wrong. So am I, incidentally. So that was a very good sort of guidance. And he looks at the European integration, the European project, very much from a cultural point of view, cultural and historic point of view of each country. And that is very important, because at the beginning, the centripetal forces in Europe were very strong. You remember when the European coal and steel community was established, Robert Schuman said, war should not be only unthinkable, but it should be physically impossible. So there was a very strong centripetal force at that time. And then as time passed, it started to dilute. Imagine that Macron was born in 1977, 32 years after the end of the Second World War. So for him, there is no experience of war. And second and third generation, no experience. So it started to dilute. And then the big crises came, and a lot of centrifuge forces arrived. Migration, the war in Ukraine, energy crisis, etc. By reading the writings of János, I didn't read all the books, but I read a lot of the articles. He emphasizes all the time within the changing world, what is permanent. Permanent is culture. Permanent is a Christian conservative view of the thing. And as the French say, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose, which means more that changes, more it's the same thing. So János emphasized those things. And I learned a lot of these things, but let me just, he looks at Central and Eastern Europe also very much as a part of Europe, but as special about the culture, which is very important. And I was invited to Brussels in 2021 for a conference on Europe. There was a big conference on Europe. And I was invited by a think tank and a huge audience, etc. And I talked about the same things, about how important culture is. And then I asked the audience, I said, we in Central and Eastern Europe, part of our curriculum is the history of the West. Of course, Rome, Greece, Rome, etc., French Revolution, First World War, Second World War. And then I asked the audience, how many of you know the history, culture, Bulgaria, Romania, and Hungary? Not a single hand. I don't know whether they wanted to be polite, but not a single hand among maybe 200 or 300 people. And here is what János said about that. Central Europe is undeniably part of Europe. Central Europe is a more intense and denser Europe, a Europe of higher revolution. And let me quote the French philosopher Henri Breguton, the future is not what will happen, but what we will do. What we will do is what the writings of János are all about. He wants to contribute to shaping the future of Europe. Thank you.
I'd like to, can you hear? Yes. I'd like to thank all three commentators. I think you wanted to reply to one of the speakers, I think Dr. Stumpf.
Yes, in fact, I should have replied it earlier. It was in my notes, but it always happens to me that I forget. So I should have replied your question earlier. It was in my notes, but as it often happens to me, I forget about half of my notes each time. But yes, I think you're right. In fact, at the time, the so-called White Book was written and also published, the main aspiration was to go back to Europe. Emotionally, psychologically, culturally, constitutionally, in every respect, economically, as it has been referred to. So that was the primary, let's say, focus. By the way, nation was equally important. I just found a text from the White Book, which I seem to have lost for the time being. But the key question is that already at that time, I underlined very, very, very strongly the national, let's say, issue. And that goes back to the year, I think, 96, The essence of the European integration process lies in upholding and even strengthening national identity. The essence of Europe lies in its diversity. If this diversity, with its many cultural and linguistic traditions, is laid to waste or even dimmed, Europe will lose its identity. So, I mean, that's the whole text. But I wouldn't deny that there is some, let's say, shift or move in this respect as well. What I would like to still underline, and this is important, I do not follow this rigid distinction between sovereignists and federalists. I recognize the political utility of this. I'm a realist, but this is not my thinking. I do believe that Europe is, in a way, both. I try to explain, by the way, what federalism from bottom up means, what subsidiarity means, again going back to the Christian roots. What bottom-up federalism meant to Protestantism, for instance, Althusius. These are key questions. But it's always from bottom up. Communities, local communities, and then building up progressively. Not federalism, the real federalism is not from the top. It's not a central rule, which seems to be some temptation towards now. At the same time, and I don't want to get into this famous discussion which we discussed with distinguished Tamás Súlyok, President of the Constitutional Court, a couple of months ago, about the constitutional identity. But member states are sovereign. And the best let's say, demonstration for that is that if they want, they withdraw. So they never really transferred or confirmed their sovereignty. Not even part of that they did not confer. What they confer is the exercise of some of the rights resulting from or based upon sovereignty, which seems to be perhaps the linguistic formal difference, but it's still there. So without getting into all the details, let's try to find both in the future European construction. And Europe has always been both, by the way, right from the beginning. It's underlined in all the basic texts. Of course, politics is using them, depending upon the political situation, which is quite normal. But at the same time, we all know that Europe is both. And if we want to keep, let's say, this against all the challenges and crises and difficulties, which I didn't touch on now, because that would have taken a long, long, long time. Then, of course, we have to maintain this course that, yes, this is a complex procedure where we recognize the sovereignty of member states. At the same time, we try to build in a bottom-up federalism, which is, of course, the origin of the cultural concept of nation. And I would like to underline again and again the cultural concept of nation, which is for us Hungarians particularly important. We all know the reasons why.
May I? Yes, please do.
Just two questions, very short one. One is I asked you, you are regularly avoid the expression of liberal world order. So you are not using as an interpretation framework, but you are not using the word at all. So you are saying that the liberal world order is not an appropriate interpretation framework for the foreign policy expert. That's one question. And the other, I don't know who chose this picture. And if you choose, You have to explain why.
Coming to the second question, I sent a couple of photos with the help of my son-in-law, because we were abroad. We were somewhere else outside of Budapest, and including this picture. But the picture itself was selected by the editor. So, but I take responsibility. So it's István. I don't want to sing this Sinatra song, but this is, of course, my way. I'm not obliged to use all the expressions which are now used everywhere. They are not compulsory. By the way, I read a long study. I cannot tell you where and when and who was the author. I'm not very good at that. But that was about the liberal world order. After having read the study, I just asked myself, couldn't we call it conservative world order? As I understand, this is rules-based. Yes, rules-based. Principle-based. Yeah? There is always an element of let's say, continuity or permanence, as said, whenever we draft rules. You, as a constitutional lawyer, know it very well. Once you put it in on the paper as a rule, it will be there. That's the main purpose. While developments are changing every day, every week, every month, the rules are there. And the same applies to the rules-based world order. The rules are there as long as we don't change them. Of course, they are changing by themselves. We all know that. But I don't feel being obliged to use the generally used expression. That was just a minor point of doubt I want to make you understand that, yes, indeed, I don't accept, for instance, as I said, in the very same way, I do not follow this kind of sharp political distinction between federalism and sovereignty. It's a little bit similar.
Is this working? Can you hear me?
If you may, I wanted to add a question about sovereignty, because János is against, as he said, against excessive centralization, and thinks that strong Europe is based on strong sovereign states. You say that, strong Europe. And let me quote something that I wrote not a long time ago about this. European nation states are the best possible units or communities divided so far that can create the confidence and commitment and sacrifice to protect freedom and democracy. The French resistance fighters and the Polish soldiers fighters on the side of the Allies during the Second World War were killed in action as French and Polish patriots loyal to their homeland. Hungarian patriots fighting for the independence of their country in 1956, they're fighting as Hungarians. These examples show that the strength of national identity is very important even in building Europe. And I also say only strong and dynamically growing nation states can guarantee a powerful European Union. Now, on the basis of that logic, János says nation states are important and the borders disappear. Nations are not defined by state borders. That's a very, very important thing in Central and Eastern Europe. Very important. Because this points to the rights of minorities, which unfortunately, within the EU, is not respected by everyone, every country, all the time, even though this is a very important part of the treaty. And János is very, very, very right when he emphasizes nations that has to be strong. And it's the same thing for the French, for the British, etc. So excessive centralization and curtailing the sovereignty of countries, not that we are 27 and maybe we'll be more, will not lead to a strong Europe. Thank you.
János.
Just one word, because György, you mentioned the Hungarian Revolution and freedom fight from 56. I think this is extremely important. I'm saying this also because I have my grandchildren around, and I want to emphasize again that without the Hungarian Revolution and freedom fight of 1956, Europe's history would have been different. I'm not sure that we could talk about European integration and union and so on and all these issues without the Hungarian Revolution. It changed Europe, it changed the world, and we should never, ever forget it. And that's why I talked about that, not yesterday, in fact, but that was the day before yesterday in Szeged. It's a key issue, and it is a part of the national history, no doubt, but it is also part of European history, and in fact, universal history. So I just try to take every and each opportunity to underline this, because that's very important for us and for our children and for our grandchildren. Thank you.
Can I just ask that very point? In your book, you mentioned, you refer to the way in which a Central European consciousness and culture developed, not initially, I think, but seriously developed in the period in which the countries in question were all living under communist regimes and in the Soviet Empire. And that's true, even though, for example, 56 and 68, the other countries did not, in fact, come to the assistance of the Hungarians or the Czechs. So the question would be exactly how did the Central European consciousness and culture advance in the years from 45, well, 46, 47, and 89? What were the actual transmission belts of information, and debate, and culture?
John, yes, but it goes back to more than 1,000 years. Oh. So, for instance, these nations took or were converted to Christianity more or less at the same time, let's say plus minus 100 or more years. More important is, if you take, for instance, just, let's say, the Poles and Hungarians. For them, Christianity was a question of national survival, which means that belonging to Europe and taking the Christian faith and Christianizing their nations and countries, that meant survival and long-term belonging to a civilization, to a culture which is now Europe. But that was, of course, the crucial element that while for many Western nations this was earlier, and it was extremely important as well, but not an existential issue. For Central Europeans, what we call Central Europeans, it was an existential issue. Lithuanians came a little bit later, okay, yeah. but all took it, Croats, Czechs, Hungarians, Poles, and so on. So that is the root, to my mind, of what we call Central European, that the belonging to Europe, because not being in the center of developments always meant an attachment and also something which was part of your, let's say, survival, too much to say, but of your existence. Now, the latest thing, that's very important. We said always in private discussions that, okay, fine, Budapest or the Hungarian Revolution was defeated, Prague, and so on and so on. But there was a common consensus that once more would do the same at the same time, it could be successful. And one of the problems, one of the tragedies with the Hungarian, Czechoslovak, and so on, and Polish, of course, uprisings or movements, was that they were they were fairly isolated and lonely. And that was probably, let's say, something which is to be blamed for those same nations. But at the end of the day, still, they managed in different ways, but more or less at the same time. So, but I think this remark is very pertinent, that while they were successive uprisings and movements, only a couple of decades later, they could become successful.
Thank you. Let me now throw open the questions to the floor, and then after that, I'll invite everybody to have a final say. Can I take a question from the floor? There's a young lady there who will, with a microphone, who will come down to your row and hand it to you. Can I see a hand raised? Come, this is very disappointing. Yes, Mr. Hayward over there. Steve Hayward, who's a visiting fellow at the Danube Institute, a distinguished fellow of Claremont too.
It should be on. Is it on now? I think, okay. I have a loud voice. Thank you, John. Yes, I was going to introduce myself very briefly. I'm Stephen Hayward, thrilled to be here for a month as a fellow of the Danube Institute. It's a great relief because otherwise I am an inmate, as I put it, at UC Berkeley, which is maybe not unlike living here before 1989. That's another story for another day. More of a comment than a question, but I'm much taken with the challenge that was raised about János not using the conventional terms like rules-based international order. And it's become something of a crusade of mine to tell people not to use the conventional language that catches on. I mean, when I first heard rules-based international order, I thought, well, sounds perfectly sensible. Who could be against an international order with rules? But the more I started thinking about the kind of people saying it and the bad ideas they were attaching it to, I started to realize that there was potential for great mischief in that phrase. So I don't know if this will work here. It works very well in America. I had a friend who used to say, whenever you hear some great idea, especially from a bureaucracy for something to improve the world, you should stop, repeat the idea aloud in a German accent, and see if it still sounds as good. Right. So, I mean, that's just a comment more than a question, but I sort of want to plant it and reinforce János's instinct on this. And I have a whole long list of terms that are used in America and elsewhere that we ought to purposely avoid using and think of our own alternative terms. So, thanks.
Steve, I'm sorry for my bad English. It works? But I definitely said rules-based international order. That's what I said, rules-based international order. István asked the question, why don't I use the word liberal international order? To which I said, I think the main point is that it is a rules-based international order, whether I call it liberal or conservative. For me, it's not a decisive issue. Because if I read the criteria the supposed criteria of the liberal international order, then I just ask the question to myself, why don't I call it conservative international order? But the key point is that this is rules-based, principle-based. That is what I try to underline, but I'm sorry if I was not precise enough. Or maybe it didn't work well.
Leading to mischief in our country.
Okay.
Perfectly sensible.
Yeah, next question. Gentleman here. Could you identify yourself?
Good evening. I didn't want to take the floor, but my name is János. There was a question about the photo. I have to say that this choice was excellent. On this photo, we see what characterized János very well. I met János the first time in 1984. After a so-called TDK of the civil law at the Eötvös Loránd University Faculty of Law, when I was only second year student at the law faculty. On the photo, we see Madeleine Albright. We see Bronislav Geremek. We see János, and we see the former Czech Minister of Foreign Affairs. This photo shows the Visegrad IV cooperation, in which János believed very much. I just took the floor to mention that this academic year in the College of Europe and also in Natolin was devoted to Madeleine Albright. Every year, the promotion is named after a great historical figure. And János was the founding professor from Hungary at the College of Europe in Bruges, Natolin. And this year, together with the symbolistic photo on his book, is devoted as promotion to Madeleine Albright. Thank you.
Any comment? Next question. I think that's a comment rather than a question, but thank you for it. Another question?
May I raise a generational question? So I used to say that I am the son of the 56th revolution, because my parents decided that they are going to leave Hercegkút, my village, and they changed their mind and they go back. And I am also socialized in the early 80s, where the civic circus was the dominant player, preparing the system changing. And then I also was the member of the first Orbán government. What I am asking, János, how do you characterize the generational differences of the foreign policy in Hungary? And this kind of generational differences, how could help Hungary in the future? This is the very hot issue now.
Well, I think foreign policy is perhaps a little bit more, let's say, difficult to approach from this perspective. But I think what is very much important, István, in what you have just been saying or asking, the 56, let's say, heritage is something extremely important. So my generation, for instance, we all have our own personal recollection. I was 12 and a half, 13 almost. I remember every day what happened. I can still tell you how it happened. I mean, the radio, but especially in our town, Szeged, how it was going on, the students and so on and so on. Well, by the way, it started well before 23rd, because the Szeged students founded the MEFES 15th or 16th of October. So of course, we attended a couple of those gatherings together with my father, me as a kid. So, I mean, this is in your, let's say, life, and that is decisive. I think in a different way, but for different generations, the 56 must be there. So by listening to people, by reading, lots of literature has been published for different generations. I really cannot tell you what the difference was. For instance, at the time the first Orbán government started in '98. Maybe you said some of us maybe were more experienced, quote unquote. Experienced in what? So we started the market economy and democracy, okay, roughly less than 10 years ago. But all in all, I didn't really sense the generational difference. What, for instance, it was interesting. I had my Polish, let's say, connection, very strong. I forgot about to say about the Polish experience of my generation in the early 60s, from 62, 60, 61, 62, 63, 64. Most young guys of my generation, we went to Poland by hitchhiking. Starting down there in Zakopane, went to Krakow to the famous university club. The address was given from one to the other. Then when we went up to Gdańsk, and in the meantime, which was at least 1 month, we accumulated an awful lot of experiences. And since then, I am a friend of Poland, without, let's say, using too big words. But what I realized, and that's why I am telling you this, that when I first met the young leaders of Fidesz, I realized that they had the same Polish experience, more than 20 years later. All the rest, I mean, Ader, Kövér, Orbán, they all told me about their Polish experiences and how decisive the Polish experience for them was at that time, of course. That time, politically, it was much more interesting. But still, it was a Polish element in their life, in their experience. So what is the difference? Not much. Times were different.
May I just throw in this point? You said that the Hungarian Revolution changed the world. And I can give a very simple example of that. Not a very important one, perhaps, but I was 14 when it happened. 5 years later, I was at university. And of course, at university in the early 60s in Britain, there was a general predisposition to mildly pro-Soviet, mildly left-wing and further left-wing domestic opinions. And this was the common undercurrent of conversation and life. When did that conversation fall silent? It fell silent whenever a Hungarian happened to be in the room. There were some things that you couldn't say about the Soviet Union and about about the apparent compassion and virtue of communist ideas. You just couldn't say them. If there was a Hungarian there, it was too embarrassing, and you might have to defend them. Now, obviously, after 1968, that tended to die away, but it never went away entirely. And I think that was a factor in conversations in Western European and American society for a long time. And of course, that meant that when 1989 happened, well, first of all, it underpinned the policies of Reagan and Thatcher and others like Kohl and Italian governments. It underpinned those policies. And eventually, of course, it helped to bring about the revolutions, which were mainly carried out, of course, by Central Europeans, I should say. Okay, now another question, perhaps. Yes, the lady here in the front row.
Yes, hello, Claire I'm the French ambassador to Hungary. I wanted to thank János for giving this book to a non-Hungarian speaking audience, so I very much look forward to reading it. And I have a question that stems from the fact that you have this characteristic of being a lawyer turned into a politician, a great scholar, an academic, that has become a successful politician, which is not completely unusual in your country, but is unusual in other countries and maybe nowadays in my country. I very much stand by what you said about the division, the opposition between federalism and sovereignism not being such a rigid one for the reason you said very well, because sovereignty, we transfer the exercise of parts of our sovereignty. We never abandon sovereignty, which cannot be divided or abandoned. The question I wanted to ask is, how much did you anticipate against that backdrop the role that is now played by supranational courts, which do not only adjudicate on important issues for integration, but have become within the EU maybe the most versatile or producers of norms. They are now really, jurisprudence has always been a source of our common law applied to all the EU countries, but it's become, I think more and more important, relevant, and some would say dominant. So how do you think this, what question do you think this raises? Do you think there is a democratic issue behind that? How do you think it will affect, and in what sense, the robustness of the EU? And finally, do you think that this issue of the importance of supranational courts, is it perceived as for what it is by our people? And do you think that at some point, you discuss the enlargement and the prospect of the accession of many new members, which we support, is of course an important development. Do you think that it will play a part in this discussion with new candidate member states? Thank
you. Thank you, Claire, for this question. But this is a very, very complex issue. Maybe you should ask persons like justices of the Hungarian Constitutional Court or former justices of the European Court of Justice. But what I think we discussed also before, the dividing line between values and law, it's very fragile and risky. But I think that's an issue for each and every Supreme Court or Constitutional Court, whether this is United States or European continental, let's say German type constitutional justice. So it's not easy. It's sensitive, politically sensitive. We all know that. It's extremely sensitive in the case of European Court of Justice because then it is compounded by a kind of sovereignty versus federalism element. But we have to live with that. And that's why I try to always underline that reasonable self-restraint is needed. Dialogue between national constitutional courts and the European Court of Justice, of course, should be more, let's say, intensive. Looking at each other, listening to each other, trying to take into account what the other says. In this famous German case, I don't want to go into all the details which we discussed perhaps before and we'll discuss at another time. But I remember, for instance, I asked my friend years ago, Andrea Juhas, that don't you think that sometimes Strasbourg Court and even the Brussels-Luxembourg Court goes a little bit further than applying the law? And then he gave a very, very relevant answer, which I still recall, and said, we react to what we are asked to do. If they ask us the question, we are bound to answer that. So if people ask questions of that type, of course, the court is in a way obliged to say something. Otherwise, they would run the risk of déni de justice, that is denial of justice, by not answering to a question which is posed to them. Well, okay, maybe I a little bit simplify this, but we don't have too much time, John. So next time we discuss it. Okay.
May I first of all remind you of two things. At the close of this discussion, there are books available at the back, which both Catherine Kaidar-Lynn and the author would like you to buy. And so would we. Secondly, at 7 o'clock, we will be moving into the gallery where there is a reception, and we look forward to meeting you all there. That means we now have 5 minutes in which there is for the speakers to say one final thing, and there is one question. Was it here? Yes, the gentleman here. Can we make that question short, sharp, and effective, and equally the replies too?
Well, I'll try. Heinrich Kreft is my name. I'm a German diplomat and currently a professor at András University in Budapest. Mr. Martonyi, given your broad, deep, and long experience in European foreign policy, political culture, is there, in your mind, still a difference between political culture on this side of the former Iron Curtain, on the other side of the Iron Curtain? I'm a German, as I said, and this is the case in Germany, and it's very much discussed inside Germany. What is your feeling about this?
If I have to answer your question, I know the situation in Germany and how Eastern Germans were looked upon differently. We, in Central and Eastern Europe, we are looked upon differently. This is what I was referring before. When they look at us, I'm not saying that they think they are that much superior, but they might. Certainly there is a tendency to lecture us. I was, when I was deputy governor, I went to many times to the below ministerial level of economic discussions, and you know, I saw that they were lecturing us, and it's still true. If Macron dares to say that Hungary is that the EU is not an ATM. Okay, so what does it mean? Would he say that to any other country that receives a lot of cohesion funds like Spain or Italy? So there is that divide in the culture. It will slowly disappear, and this is what János has also emphasized in his books, that we have to understand each other's culture, and it will take time. Thank you.
Yeah, I would make two comments. One, as reference was made to future incoming enlargements, I would certainly refrain from discussing legal and constitutional issues in the presence of legal authorities as an economist. But
could you
in another way of approaching the same thing, I think, if we don't want to divide the world between federalists and sovereignists, at least I think it is important to recognize that in the future development of the EU integration, we should seek elements of flexibility which responds to the growing diversity within the Union and less to the uniformization of solutions. And the other point is that I think this book is very valuable to the Hungarian audience, but if we want the political culture to converge, then I think it will be useful for readers outside Hungary also, and I hope they will read.
I just would like to emphasize one sentence in my preface, that the essays in the final volume, The Nation and Europe, span Martonyi's career as a lawyer, politician, and university professor, and offer the Anglophone readers an insight into one of the finest political minds in Europe today. Congratulations, János.
Thank you very much. The best thing to do now is to remain silent. By the way, I did want to answer your question because I tried to write about that difference, in fact. And there are differences still, also in the culture, let's say political culture. But to my mind, they are sometimes exaggerated. on both sides.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank the speakers on your behalf. They have proved it's possible to have an intelligent, serious, and sophisticated conversation without descent into rhetorical violence, even the rhetorical violence disguised by phrases like rules-based international order. And I want to apologize for people I think I've missed. I should have introduced. Geza, is that you at the back? And we have former... Sorry, thank you. I couldn't see him. May I mention Geza Jarzynski, another distinguished foreign minister of Hungary in the democratic age, is with us as well. Thank you. And having said that, I want to welcome your applause and to say that I look forward to chatting about this event with you over a glass of wine in a minute or two. Thank you very much indeed.